The nationwide strike today was in support of a better minimum wage than what government is proposing. But workers are also protesting changes to strike legislation. The Labour Department says the new laws are necessary because strikes have become more prevalent, last longer, and are increasingly violent. Not so, says Carin Runciman, who's a senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg's Centre for Social Change. Carin joins me now in studio. Carin, welcome. So we have these new labour laws. It's mainly amendments to the Labour Relations Act and the Basic Conditions of Employment Act that are meant to sort of improve the labour environment in South Africa. But you believe these are not necessary, are they?
Well, the argument made by the Department of Labour, as you said, is that strikes are very prevalent and they're prolonged and they're violent. And this simply just doesn't hold out in the data. Looking at the last decade, overall the number of working days lost due to strike action has actually declined. Now this is surprising given that we've had a number of very big strikes like the 2010 public sector strike and the 2014 platinum strike, but that's actually what the data says, that there actually has been a decline in the number of working days lost. Again, the nature of the prolonged nature of them, over 3/4 are resolved within 2 weeks. So again, this argument that strikes are prolonged doesn't really hold up. And finally, that they are increasingly violent, again, doesn't hold up when we look at police data, which is the most reliable data that we have available. Working with a team at the Centre for Social Change, we found that 88% of labour-related protests are actually peaceful. So the argument that is made about the need to change strike legislation just simply doesn't hold up to the evidence.
So explain these two concepts for me. This number of work stoppages, which seems to be going up if you look at the data that you base your argument on. I mean, around 2006, we had about 99 work stoppages recorded, and by 2016, we're looking at 122. But you're saying this doesn't necessarily translate to the number of work hours lost. What's the difference there then?
So there's a big difference between looking at the number of work stoppages and the number of working days lost. Work stoppages sometimes can last for even less than a day. So it's quite an unreliable indicator in which to base whether strike action is increasing or decreasing. It's a much more reliable measure to use the number of working days lost, because then that gives us a measure of how long strikes are going on for at the same time. So it's really the international measure that is also used, the number of working days lost as opposed to the number of work stoppages. So while it is true the number of work stoppages has increased slightly, that increase hasn't been particularly dramatic, and much more importantly, the number of working days lost has declined overall.
But realistically, in the labour environment, Carin, we've had some pretty violent strikes that have taken place over the last few years. Of course, the blight of them all is the Marikana massacre of 2012. And we've had strikes that have lasted quite a long, that have been protracted. You remember the platinum strike. So if the arguments are not borne out by evidence that the department presents, what do you think is behind it? Is it ideological?
I think it is ideological, and I think that just needs to be made clear. The labour amendments that are proposed will benefit employers by giving them more tools to frustrate workers in their ability to exercise what is a constitutional right at the end of the day. It's a constitutional right to strike, by extending conciliation, by imposing a secret ballot, but also dragging workers through advisory arbitration, which will be a very technical process, which will mean that strike action will not be in the hands of workers. And while any violence and strikes must be regarded as serious, we must also look on whose side the violence comes from. Very often we're led to believe that it comes from the side of workers, but in many cases it comes from private security or even the police. So we need to be balanced in how we analyse this problem of violence, even though it is actually in the minority of cases where violence occurs.
And what is your take on this national minimum wage, which of course has been stalled? It was meant to kick in on the 1st of May, but because of the parliamentary and legislative processes has been delayed.
Well, the obvious criticism to make about the national minimum wage is that it is not a living wage. And that's very clear, and even the government admits that this is not a living wage. However, what is also very concerning is the possibility that the minimum wage might not even be enforceable. What the amendments to the Basic Conditions of Employment Act mean is that rather than the Department of Labour, which is currently being responsible for the enforcement, this enforcement will now be put on to the CCMA. And this is very concerning because the CCMA caseload is growing very considerably. At the moment, on average, 945 cases are referred a day. Once it takes over the responsibility for the national minimum wage enforcement, we can imagine how much this is going to grow. And there's very little extra funding being given to the CCMA to handle this extra mandate. So while we can argue about what the amount of the national minimum wage should be, it will all be meaningless if it is not enforced.
All right, thank you so much for coming through. Carin Runciman coming out to speak to us about those proposed changes to the labour laws that, of course, have been the subject of many of the protests that we have seen today.